Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Clara, and hello to everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in. This is the third in the webinar series, and today we're going to be talking to you about benefit sharing within water management and water governance. And as Clara said, I'm happy to also have our colleagues from our Quito office, Emilio and Maria Laura, on board, which will be great because they'll be able to provide some regional input and experience for you. So just to give you a bit of an overview of where we're going to go today with our talk, I'm going to provide a conceptual, theoretical overview to the way that the IUCN Water Program and Environmental Law Center has been moving forward with our work on benefit sharing in river basins and within water governance. And then we'll have a pause for questions, and then we'll take a deep dive further into the benefit sharing approach, but from the perspective of an example from the Lake Titicaca Basin, which is what Emilio and Maria Laura will be able to present to you today, which will be really nice. So we'll be following this, this outline. So as we all know, water is a shared resource. It's in high demand. Globally, there's immense pressure on water resources. We know that there's pressure from multiple users, multiple sectors, agriculture, energy, mining, domestic water supply and needs. And we also know that these demands are often reaching unsustainable levels. Within this context, of course, this can often be exacerbated by increase in population and demand, therefore climate change and the impacts of this. And so therefore, because of this pressure, the way that we see things, and I think this is a completely understood within the water sector, is that you can no longer, there's no such thing as managing water for a single purpose anymore. All water management is multi-objective because of this myriad of actors. And therefore, we really have to navigate these competing interests. And as we heard, therefore, in the previous webinars, I hope everyone had tuned into them, from a transboundary perspective, we know that globally, 60% of our water resources are transboundary basins. And that means that there's even more pressure and even more potential challenges, but also opportunities that arise from the variety of demands and needs and water users, all trying to access the same water bodies. And as we heard from Dr. Issa last week in the webinar and the previous week, that unfortunately, though, a lot of these river basins lack forms of cooperative and legal frameworks and institutions to help equitably and sustainably manage these water resources. And where existing frameworks do appear, they are often not inclusive or participatory enough, and in that case sometimes exclude key stakeholders from decision making. I think there's something that we would also like to add within this benefit sharing context as well, is that a lot of the work that IUCN has been doing on this has focused on the transboundary level, and also in terms of the broader water governance work has also focused on transboundary. But I think that a lot of the work that we have done on benefit sharing can also be seen from a national perspective, where often at a national level, you can have a basin which covers potentially different counties, different regions, and you still come across similar issues around the need to cooperate amongst different groups of water users for a more sustainable use of water resources. So, as I said, these pressures on the water resources and river basins globally come from a myriad of different interests. They can be different in nature, of course, political, socio-cultural, environmental, economic drivers. And what we try and put forward in the work that we do is trying to balance these often quite different demands and the trade-offs that arise from having such a busy space in terms of the demands on water resources and the pressures. And so we try and think about managing these trade-offs to make sure that everyone wins in some way. For us, it's important to explore these trade-offs, to look at how water is used and to identify both the positive and negative impacts and the associated benefits, and how these can be distributed under alternative development scenarios. And so within this context, the way that we see this is that you need a negotiation process that allows for this range of concerns and interests from all stakeholders to be taken into account. And this is where we put forward this approach that we've been developing on benefit sharing. And it very much relates to work over a decade ago that Sadoff and Gray have written extensively about, that talks about an alternative approach to negotiation of shared waters and water resources. And their definition states that it refers to any action designed to change or optimize the allocation of costs and benefits associated with cooperation. So it's really a process where riparians cooperate in optimizing equitably the different benefits that arise from shared water resources. And this focus on sharing benefits rather than water volumes and water quantities and allocating water quantities enables a sort of release of countries and stakeholders from this competition over a single finite source, but looking at it in a broader, more holistic approach. And this allows countries and basins and actors to be more flexible, and it provides a greater scope for optimizing the range of benefits from these trade-offs that arise. So we look at benefit sharing within the broader context of water governance, and as Dr. Issa has been presenting in the last few cases, what we understand by that. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that transboundary river basins are complex. Not only transboundary, but river basins, whether at national or subnational scale, are complex. There's always a range of pressures, a range of actors requesting and needing and demanding the resource. And therefore, with this benefit sharing approach, it provides a more fair and effective and sustainable water management approach. And it provides this alternative access and way to the conventional way of negotiating shared resources and cooperation. I think also one thing that we have certainly noticed in our work is that it can promote transboundary water cooperation as well. It can support regional integration and peace because it enables these win-win outcomes. So it's looking at how you can distribute benefits for all, not just looking at one country getting more water than the other and one losing out. And fundamentally, this concept is really grounded in the key understandings of equitable and reasonable utilization of water resources, so the sustainability of the resource primarily. This is an infographic we put together. I don't know how clear you can see the little details, but that's not too much of a problem. We can share resources and where to find this later online, and you can go through it in more detail. But the important thing to note with this is just to introduce you to how we see water benefits and the range of benefits. So we're not just looking about allocating quantities of water here. We're looking at the economic benefits, the social benefits, the ecosystem benefits, and then these broader benefits as well that look beyond river basins, that bridge transboundary cooperation in the form of regional and economic benefits, and these peace and security benefits. So it tries to expand the traditional understanding of benefits that you derive from water management. And this typology will be, Emilia will go into more detail and explain this from the perspective of Lake Titicaca, but this is just to give you an overview from a conceptual perspective. So just to recap a few key points, and I think from our understanding of work that we've done on this, that has really stood out to us and have been highlights and important challenges, but also key points of learning for us, is that yes, some of the key considerants you have to remember is that there's a variety of interests, there's a variety of economic, social, political, and environmental dimensions to shared water resources management, and therefore within this benefit sharing approach, that you have these diverse sectors, you have stakeholders coming from a range of different perspectives. For example, when you look at stakeholders coming from the energy sector, they often look at a scale that is broader than the basin. They look at a national level scale and responding to national level energy demands, whereas agriculture doesn't necessarily look at the same scale or might look at a different scale. So it's important also to take these different perspectives into play. As I mentioned as well, there's also the understanding on trade and regional integration, and the politics and the political context, the political economy context around shared waters and cooperation and understanding how to share benefits. Then there's also the understanding, when you look at upstream and downstream, the compensation for pollution, impacts of potential new infrastructure, and the trade-offs that brings to different stakeholders within basins, and therefore the range of potential benefits and co-benefits that different interventions and development scenarios provide. You have the non-consumptive benefits as well, navigation, recreation, these different uses of the water courses that don't take water out necessarily in the way that agriculture does. And something that we find is very critical to our work is the importance of a diversity of stakeholders, the inclusion of all relevant stakeholders within a participatory decision-making process around this benefit sharing approach. And as I mentioned as well, political will, yes, you need also as an enabling environment to have countries that are willing to come together, or different counties that might have differing approaches or slightly different water implementation plans. I know in Kenya, for example, with the decentralization process, counties have their own powers to develop their own water management rules. And so even within a national basin, like the Tana Basin, for example, you can have a range of different water plans, even within one basin. And therefore that leads to also then capacity challenges around both financially and technically the ability to invest in these range of different potential development scenarios, but also understanding the range of benefits that come and the trade-offs that come with these decisions. So what we're going to present in more detail, what Emilio and Maria Laura will present in more detail, is really this approach that IUCN has developed in the last several years, based off over a decade of work through 14 river basins globally, through our Bridge project mainly. And it's about benefit sharing in the context that I've provided, and trying to bridge, fill a gap in how to operationalize this. As I said, the definition that we use from benefit sharing comes from 2005. The concept of benefit sharing has been around for decades, but they're talking to other practitioners and other institutions and organizations. There's been a clear operational gap in terms of how to actually get this going on the ground. How do I do this in practice in my basin, and considering all the complexities and the political context and the sensitivities and how do I do this? So this is what we want to present to you today, is that this framework that we've put together. We have already a training package that we've developed that is available online, and we're happy to share that with you and provide more answers if you have questions on this later. And so, as I said, this piece of work is really about operationalizing the benefit sharing approach that goes beyond negotiating water volumes allocated to different needs. So it opens up a dialogue process to appreciate these range of benefits that I spoke about that are available in river basins, and therefore looking at the trade-offs and how we can distribute these benefits amongst the shared stakeholders. So just to give you an overview of the steps that Emilio will go through in a minute in more detail using the Lake Titicaca example, we've put forward this 6-step framework to benefit sharing. Now, if you look at it on the screen, you say 6 steps, 1 to 6, okay, I go 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks quite linear. That's not our intention. This is just the way that we found it makes it the most accessible to bring it together and to operationalize it practically in basins. Of course, there's flexibility in this approach, and you'll see as we go through in more detail to explain it that you can find and adjust this approach to the realities of your basins and the challenges you find. So the way that we work through it is following a process with stakeholders where you start by, in this first step, identifying stakeholders and mapping their interests and influence. And this is key in making sure that we abide by these inclusive and equitable and participatory values that we uphold within the water governance work that we do, ensuring that this understanding of benefits to all and understanding who gets what and the potential power imbalances between different stakeholders. And that's very important to understand moving forward in this work. And then building on that, mapping out and understanding the range of benefits based on the understanding and the range of benefits I provided earlier, looking at this from a perspective of either one potential development within the basin or different scenarios, but really to understand what stakeholders within the basin will be impacted in which way, and negative or positive, and what benefits there will be from different development scenarios, and how we can find compromises where these benefits can be shared equitably. Then moving into step 3, that is where that work on understanding in more detail how these benefits can be shared amongst the different development scenarios. And Emilia will be able to provide you more detail in a little bit on that. Step 4 then looks at trying to quantify and estimate the cost and benefit, the cost related to these benefits and related to these alternative scenarios, so that stakeholders can sit there and deliberate on what potential scenario might work best for all stakeholders involved. And then the next step is really around, between those stakeholders, then negotiating and working through a dialogue process that's both inclusive and participatory on how to best share the benefits and which potential development scenario, investment scenario, everyone is comfortable with and willing to move forward. And then the final step would be around consolidating these negotiations and these decisions around which scenarios to move forward with in terms of outlining key legal frameworks and key legal documents, and therefore linked to institutional agreements and mandates, and how the benefit sharing agreements would work in practice within the institutional and governance, and then in practice management frameworks that are existing in the basins currently. Right, I'm going to stop there for some questions. I hope you could all follow my slides and that was clear. I apologize if I didn't make any sense. My 2-year-old daughter was up most of the night, so I was trying to put one word in front of the other. But yeah, I leave it back to you, Clara, to see if there are any questions that that I can take from the participants.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and well done, especially in light of having been up most of the night. It shows resilience. So we have two questions. One is very straightforward from Marisa Enser, who would like to have the link to the training packages. So if maybe you could at some point answer to that question from in the question box to everybody, send the link of the training packages if it's available on the IUCN website or on the ELC website. And then there is another question around benefits from Kevin. Kevin, can I quickly unmute you and you ask your question? Kevin is one of the team leaders in one of the projects funded by the collaboration in South Africa. He works as a consultant, but also as part of the University of the Western Cape. Kevin, you are unmuted. Please go ahead. Kevin?
Yes, you can hear me?
Yes,
yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So my question relates to the benefits and whether there's a hierarchy to the benefits. To what extent are some of the benefits non-negotiable, and what are the trade-offs, or how do you manage the trade-offs between the different benefits?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a really interesting one, and as you say, I mean, I think depending on certain scenarios that are put forward, if there's a dam that's going to be built, there are certain, as you say, certain impacts and consequences, whether positive or negative, that are not going to be able to be negotiated. And certainly certain stakeholders are going to feel pressure from other stakeholders in terms of whether their voices are heard. I think one of the key things about putting this approach forward is trying to open up a different negotiation and dialogue space, which allows these kind of conversations to be had. Some of the difficult conversations around the equitable, and sustainable sharing of resources amongst stakeholders, also that potentially don't have traditionally a seat at the decision-making table, and then therefore are marginalized or not listened to. So I would say that that the hope is in this form of dialogue that you are able to open up a negotiation that potentially in some cases weren't there before, and also to shed light, I think, a little bit more on the range of impacts and benefits that can be derived from a particular investment decision within a basin. Often decisions are put on the table where the range of impacts and the range of benefits to the range of stakeholders isn't necessarily looked at in the detail that it can be, and the trade-offs aren't necessarily transparently discussed in the way that they can be. So I think that this approach does provide that increased participation, transparency, accountability to a negotiation process.
Rebecca, if I may add, and Kevin, on the hierarchy of benefits and what Rebecca just said, I think the important part when you negotiate benefits, both in water governance and in general natural resources governance, is really around understanding very much the locality in which you're operating. So from a physical perspective, geomorphological perspective, but also socioeconomic, and in terms of power relations as well. And then once you have this picture clear, you can start to pan out what could be the benefits and how could they translate, and then through the dialogue that she was just mentioning, try to prioritize them with the stakeholders to make sure that what you have on the table is relevant to all the partners involved. And if you want to do more analysis on that, there is a very good sort of approach to negotiation for sustainability, which is called the mutual gains approach, which is something that really brings to the fore this idea of how important it is to gather knowledge and insights on when you operate, and also link that then to the actions that are potentially of value to improve the situation going forward within a sustainability triangle. So always keeping in mind, and that's something, Rebecca, that really touched me about your presentation, keeping in mind not just the short-term localized benefits, but also always keeping an eye into the longer-term future vision that you're trying to build, including that of peace building and human security, basically.
Yeah.
So I don't see any other. Is there a follow-up question for that, Kevin? Have we exhausted that the discussion on benefits? And if we have, are there any other questions at this stage on this introduction that Rebecca gave to us on the benefit sharing in water governance? I suppose with silence we have a go ahead. So I think now we pass the word to Emilio and Laura Pinheiros for the second part of the presentation and the case study from Lake Titicaca, which has tremendous childhood memories for me, not because I've been there, but because of reading wonderful stories about it. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing these case studies from a personal as well as professional perspective. Thank you very much, and you are the presenters, Emilio, so the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, for the first introductory part.
Thank you, Clara, and thanks, Rebecca, for the introductory section. Good afternoon to everyone. So my intention here will be to explain you these steps that have been developed for the methodological approach of benefit sharing using the example of one of our basins in South America. No? We have an interesting case that we think it can be well approached using such a methodology. And I want you to explain you briefly what are the challenges that we are facing in this basin and how we are trying to solve them using these steps of the benefit sharing approach. So the Titicaca Basin is a transboundary basin shared between Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. It's a very interesting landscape, one of the highest plateaus in the world, together with the Himalayas. As you can see, the mean altitude is around 3,800 meters above sea level. It's a very big basin, almost 144,000 square kilometers. The economic activities in this basin are mainly agricultural practices, grazing, mining, and a little bit of tourism. It's a basin that is actually highly vulnerable to climate change. We are facing problems of water scarcity. The effects of climate change are adding a lot of pressure into water resources. Adding to that, we have also a concerning pace of ecosystem degradation and water pollution, and also a chaotic expansion of the urban areas and a chaotic change of land uses, no, due to lack of planning. And all this is a cocktail of elements that are making the future of this basin quite complex. No? So in the case of benefit sharing, you can approach the problem from a different perspectives, and you can use this methodology also for different purposes. No? So the scale at which you use the methodology can change depending on what you need. In this case, for example, we can talk about the whole developmental pathway of the Titicaca Basin. That would mean to talk about all the major infrastructure projects, developmental initiatives, conservation projects, policies that are trying to be implemented in this basin, and all the cooperation schemes between Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. But in order to make this exercise a little bit more simple and easier to go through, we will focus only on one issue that is happening right now in the basin. And there is a conflict between Bolivia and Peru because Peru is taking part of the water flow of a river that goes through the Titicaca to do a water diversion system to the Pacific basins. So they are taking out water to irrigate lands in the Pacific. And of course, taking out this flow of water of a river that is flowing into Bolivia will generate a lot of impacts in the agricultural sector of Bolivia and on the environment. So this is making a lot of conflicts between stakeholders in the basin. And we see that there can be alternatives to this project that wants to be implemented. So historically, Peru has been taking part of these waters since the 60s to the Pacific basins. However, there is a new phase of this project that is now approved and they want to build it. So we're trying to see what alternatives we can have to this project and how we can use the benefit sharing methodology to find a better solution, to think about the benefits to everyone and to try to come out with a sustainable pathway for this problem. So in first hand, basically, we need to start understanding who are in the basin, which are the stakeholders, and what are the links between them, how much power have them. So it's not only about identifying the stakeholders, but also about mapping that influence characteristics and that power regimes that each stakeholder may have. So who are the stakeholders? Those who gather the benefits or incur impacts from the use of water, those who represent water users' interests. We have to think on different sectors, stakeholders in agriculture, mining, tourism, environment, biodiversity. Formal and informal, this is very important. Sometimes we tend to think of stakeholders as institutions, NGOs, associations, but we forget about the informal stakeholders that usually have a very important role when it comes to water management. Also think about local to national levels. What happens if we overlook some stakeholders? So why is it important to be very detailed and take time to identify everyone? Stakes and interests can also be overlooked if we overlook stakeholders, and that means that benefits and impacts and costs are overlooked. So the whole exercise will be sacrificed and biased. The relative size of benefits and impacts may be overlooked as well. Distributional impacts are not adequately assessed. The results are less equitable, and there is less buy-in in the resulting agreement. So we want to have everyone on board. We want to recognize every stakeholder that has a stake on water management in order to make this exercise successful. Here an example of what we find out in the case of Titicaca. It took several months to make this analysis, and we came out with this list of stakeholders. As you see, from above to below, we have from local to national to transnational stakeholders. These include farmers, a network of women that we formed with Bridge project in IUCN, irrigation associations, indigenous leaders. Something very interesting about this basin is that most of the population is indigenous population, and this is a very particular context because the cultural and anthropological dimension of water management and of conflict solving needs to take a deeper look into that elements. Tourism agencies, agricultural associations, wool producers. As I told you, grazing is one of the main activities, but mainly for llamas, alpacas, and sheep. So wool is one of the main economic activities in the basin. Mining associations, there are some mining activities, particularly in the Bolivian side of the basin. Aquaculture associations, infrastructure companies. In this case, we thought infrastructure companies were a very important stakeholders because they are pushing for building infrastructure and they have a lot of power and influence in the governments. So they need to be in the dialogue. local municipalities. Because of competencies, municipalities are in charge of land planning and of implementing river basin plans, so they are critical in the governance of the basin. Environmental NGOs, governmental institutions such as the Ministries of Water, Ministries of Environment, the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, because we are dealing also with a transboundary context here. And finally, the Binational Authority of Lake Titicaca. In this case, this basin has already, for more than 2 decades, a commission, an independent institution with a transboundary character that is in charge of facilitating and coordinating the activities between both countries. And of course, many of these problems need to be solved from that institution. So what we are doing from IUCN is to build capacities in the authority of Lake Titicaca so that they can be also one of the main actors implementing and promoting the benefit sharing methodology. Once we understand this array of stakeholders and how they interact with each other, it's important to start thinking on the range of benefits, to identify the benefits that arise from water use. And here it's very important to think beyond water. We always say water is more than water, and a lot of the benefits are not the common activities we use to think about when we are working with water. There are indirect uses of water that need to be very well recognized. There are some dimensions such as the economic, social, political, and environmental that need to be very well analyzed in order to gather the right and the complete array of benefits. Very important to think also on the non-consumptive benefits of water use. For example, fisheries, the benefits of navigation, recreation, habitat for biodiversity, or hydropower generation. Again, as Rebecca told you before, we want to think of benefits rather than volumes of water. So forget about flows. This is about thinking on the uses and the benefits people extract from a water course, but also what can we give to a water course in terms of benefits, ecological benefits, like ecological flows, for example. So the idea is to share benefits rather than volumes of water allocation. Also to think about benefits and costs at the basin scale from national to local. In this case of the Titicaca, we even are thinking about benefits outside the basin, because as I told you, Peru is taking a percentage of the flow of water of one of the rivers to the Pacific basin to irrigate lands there, which is another basin. So we need to think also on the costs and benefits that that other basin is having, because water is going there. So it's very important to think on that linkages between landscapes and basins, and how some of the activities and initiatives that are taking place in one basin are also having cascade effects at the national and transboundary levels. So more efficient and equitable management of the basin, since it enables to separate the physical location of development from the economic distribution of costs and benefits. There are different ways of categorizing the benefits. This is one of the ways to do it that we have been using with Bridge, and basically it focuses on 4 main categories. One is the benefits you give to the river or to the basin, which are the environmental benefits, we like to call it like that. For example, flood control, drought mitigation, erosion and sediment management through ecosystem conservation or restoration, conservation of wetlands and biodiversity, water quality preservation, and the application of ecological flows, there can also be another type of benefits that are arising from the river, and this have more to do with economic benefits. No, for example, how we can extract more efficiently water from an aquifer, and this can have increased yields in a food production system, and hence increased income to local families, enhance the livelihoods, or how we can have a better extraction of fisheries through an improved conservation of a wetland. Another category can be because of the river, and this has to do with political benefits. For example, how a better scheme of benefit sharing in a river basin can translate into better cooperation between countries, into more political stability, into the improvement of policies regarding agriculture, energy, security. So these are benefits that usually we don't think, because they are not direct benefits arising from cooperation. And it's very important that you think on that margins and frontiers of the uses of water, in order to make this exercise valuable and in order to make visible the invisible. There are a lot of collateral benefits arising from the use of waters that are usually overlooked, and hence here we try to identify that links and to make visible all that potential benefits that can arise from the use of water. Some of them will be actual benefits that you can see in the actual time, but others may be in the future, potential benefits from the use, for example, of a well-preserved wetland that may be an opportunity for doing tourism activities, maybe 10 years from now. So think also on that potential uses, because the whole exercise needs to visualize that benefits. And finally, other benefits that go beyond the basin and the river. And this is about peace, greater cooperation in other realms. For example, regional integration. So if from water we can build better agreements between countries, that can be a first step to build better agreements in terms of economic transactions or trade. Regional investments, how each country can invest in the other country, how they can share infrastructure, and how they can diversify their economies. In the case of the Titicaca, we have come out with a number of different benefits that are categorized in these different typologies. So you see here economic benefits, social benefits, ecosystem benefits, regional benefits, and other ones that are arising from the peace and security. Some examples of economic benefits: increased productivity in agriculture. So we are thinking on a scenario where Peru and Bolivia start talking to each other and reaching agreements about how to avoid building this infrastructure, this water diversion system, taking out the water of the Mauri River, and instead implementing a more efficient way of using the waters in this basin. So what are the benefits that will arise from this scenario? Well, increased tourism, because ecosystems will be better preserved, enhanced livelihoods, for example, for local populations, increased household incomes, reduced costs for productive activities. In the case of social type of benefits, for example, improved health from better water quality. Why? Because the river, the flow of the river, of the Mauri River, is also diluting some natural heavy metals in the basin. So when Peru is extracting the water from this river, less flow means more concentration of pollutants. And this is having a consequence in some of the lakes down the river in the Bolivian side. So there are a lot of connections and different impacts of taking water from this river that can also be translated into social benefits. Other benefits are more of the regional characteristics. For example, the development of regional markets for goods, increase of cross-border investments, better relations between Bolivia and Peru will mean also that they can share costs for example, transnational infrastructure networks, improved road systems, or energy projects shared between both countries. Other benefits are related to the ecological dimension, for example, habitat preservation, the reduced risk of extinction of several endemic species. We have in the Titicaca a couple of very sensitive and red-listed species. Also the protection of key ecosystem services, and also climate resilience in the Altiplano. No? We want to have healthy ecosystems in these basins because the ecosystems will build resilience also for the local economies. And finally, some benefits that are on the dimension of peace and security, reduced risk of conflicts, strengthening of international water law, and improved diplomatic relations. So as you can see, from one problem that seems very localized in one part of the basin, we can start having a cascade of effects and benefits that can translate into an improved scenario, no, for how the future looks for this basin. And then is when we go to the next step, which is building benefit and enhancing scenarios. So what we want to do in this step is to think of different options of doing things in the basin. No? Right now, we have this concerning decision of implementing this water diversion system in the Mauri River that will cause impacts in both countries and that will harm relations between Bolivia and Peru. Now, what are the other options? What can Peru do to avoid having these impacts? No? And there may be 1, 2, 3, or a number of different alternatives, no, or combinations of alternatives in the basin, so that the impacts are different and the benefits are allocated in a different way. No? And the spirit of doing this step and building the scenarios is that. No? Scenarios can help in turning towards cooperation paths and approaches that could otherwise be missed or avoided. No? It is very important because it's based on an analysis of understanding the current and historic trends and events. As I told you, we have a historical problem here because water diversion has been occurring since the 60s. And now what they want to do is to expand this water diversion system and take more water out of the river. So there is already a historic trend. There has been already diplomatic tension because of this issue, and building different scenarios will help in finding and visibilizing other solutions. Scenario building helps also to switch mindsets from only one possible future towards a number of possible watershed developmental alternatives. And they can provide knowledge on potential future events, presenting alternative images of this future and making the invisible alternatives more visible. Of course, this should be done in a participatory way through workshops, including all the stakeholders. So since we are in this step, we are already having a dialogue, no? And it's very important that you conceive the whole 6 steps of the benefit sharing methodology as a process, no? A process that is not simple, a process that will take time, a process that will demand information, quality data before conducting it, no? And a process that will demand from you a very deep understanding of the problems and the interlinkages that you have in your basin. So building the scenarios can be done in a participatory way, as I tell you. It can be done in different with different methods. No, we have been trying to do this through workshops that include vision development, the recognition and identification of alternatives, the proposition of new projects or modified projects from the existing ones, and based on that we come out with a matrix of options. Here I am showing you a very simplified table, no, where we have 3 different options for the problematic we are facing with the Mauri River. No? So as you see on the left, water use activities. In this column, we have the 3 options we are going to work with and to assess. One is that Peru moves on with the water diversion project in the Mauri River. No, so things will move forward as planned. The second option is a cooperation scenario where Peru decides to avoid expanding their water diversion project, but instead implementing an irrigation efficiency initiative in Tacna, in the valley where they take this water to, so they don't need extra water for these lands, and they avoid doing the water diversion system. No, of course, this will have a different set of benefits and costs and different stakeholders. And finally, another option that would be not doing the diversion project, but neither improving irrigation in their lands. No, so what we do here is in the column above, we have included 3 stakeholders, no, critical stakeholders, one for each country. So agriculture in Peru, agriculture stakeholders in Bolivia, wood producers in Peru, wood producers in Bolivia, tourism agencies in Peru, and tourism agencies in Bolivia. And what we do here is to evaluate the impact of each scenario, of each alternative in each of the stakeholders. No, for example, in the second case, if Peru decides to implement an improved scheme for irrigation and avoid expanding the channel, this will bring benefits for agriculturers in Peru because they will have technified irrigation systems, benefits in agriculturers in Bolivia because they will have more water because the water in the Mauri River is not being removed completely. In the case of the wool production, it will stay the same as the status quo scenario, and tourism in both Peru and Bolivia would benefit. No, so you have different ways of doing these valuations. In a simplified version, I am showing you positive, negative, and neutral impacts that can be numbered as +1, 0 for neutral, and -1 for negative impacts. And what we want to see here is the cumulative impact of each alternative. So in the right column, you see the net number of impacts per project. You see that the Mauri diversion project would have negative impact on both countries. The second alternative is the most positive. You have a +4. And the no diversion project can have a -1. So this is a very simplified matrix. You can add complexity to this exercise. You can add numbers, so it's not only plus means 1, but it can be a range from 1 to 5, for example. So you can ponder the amount, how heavy is the benefit, how big is the benefit, and rank it from 1 to 5, from 1 to 10, and do a much more detailed and complex problem. So I show you this in a very simple way of how we are doing it in the Titicaca. And then in this next table, you see a more complex scheme. No, as you see above, we have much more stakeholders from both countries. We have included here the mining sector, environmental NGOs, rural populations, some of the cities, hydropower companies, and in the left column, we are also including a number of different initiatives and alternatives that are relevant in this basin. No? For example, hydropower production, expansion of the water diversion system for Tacna, mining conservation of the Titicaca, expanded nature and tourism initiative. Of course, all these activities and initiatives are coming from the workshops you conduct with your stakeholders. So from that dialogue with people in the basin, you will have some alternatives, some different ideas of how to proceed. And what you're looking here is more when you are applying the benefit sharing methodology for solving the developmental pathway of a basin. No? So we are talking here about a much of a broader scenario where we are including infrastructure projects, ecosystem conservation initiatives, and combining them in different scenarios so that you have a number of paths that you can choose and you can assess and you can evaluate. You know? So in this case, you see a complex matrix where the net number of impacts resulted in -5 for Peru and -7 for Bolivia. No? So what you look here is a non-cooperation scenario. So things are being done without cooperation and without reaching agreements. But then you have a second option where we changed some of the activities and the way of doing the projects, no, based on the dialogues we had with the people and trying to reach a consensus on how we can diminish the impacts on the stakeholders and increase the benefits for everyone. And then we have this combination of projects that were assessed and evaluated. And here we see that the net number of impacts for Peru were +6 and for Bolivia +3. So we turned a negative situation into a net positive situation, combining different options, no? And showing that there is a different way of doing things. So I close here my section on these 3 steps. It's not easy to understand all this. It's a lot of information, but what we want is to give you a rough idea of how you can, in practical terms, implement a benefit sharing process through dialogue and also through this type of exercises. Of course, if you're going to do such a matrix with your group of stakeholders in a basin, you will need information. You will need to know very well what are the planned projects, who is wanting to build what and why, what are the concerns of the different people, what are the needs of the different stakeholders. You need to project also to the future. You need to think from the next 20, 50 years from now, what that the stakeholders will need. Also, you will need to understand very well how are the links between each stakeholder. As you see, we're going to evaluate, for example, how water efficiency in agriculture in Tacna would impact the different stakeholders in the basin. No? And for that, you need information and you need people that is well aware of the different links that these stakeholders have. So that's a general overview of how you can work with this. Of course, this is only one way of doing it. You can use your imagination and innovate on the ways of doing this exercise and trying to evaluate the benefits and costs on different developmental scenarios. This step is merely qualitative. As you see, we are not adding economic value to any impact or benefit. This is something that will be done in the next step that my colleague Maria Laura will tell you. But for now, what we have is what we are interested in identifying the positive impacts, negative impacts, and neutral impacts, so that we can have a better grasp of how the alternative scenarios behave, no, in the whole range of stakeholders. So what we want ultimately is to have a basin that is healthy, but also that is allocating benefits in an equitable way among the stakeholders. And the usefulness of this exercise, of these matrices, are that it allows us to evaluate that, no, in a very detailed way. So, Clara, maybe we have questions. If not, we can go on.
Yes. We do. Thank you very much, Emilia. I think this was a very interesting session with a case study that is transboundary in nature as well. So it brings about all the different complications of working transboundary. We have a couple of questions that are very straightforward. So Ticomborero from Resilient Waters is asking, and this is a very straightforward question, why is there a binational authority for Lake Titicaca if the basin spans 3 countries, as you mentioned, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile?
Yeah, good question. That's because Chile shares only, I think, less than 3% of the basin, and they have no population there. It's more like a very wild landscape. So most of the lake basin is shared between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, and also because the lake per se, only the big screen of lake is shared between Bolivia and Peru, and the competencies of the authority of Lake Titicaca are only on the lake, not on the basin. That's something important. No? Okay. So you can imagine the limitations of such an authority when you cannot have an influence on the basin scale, but rather only on the water course.
Yeah, thank you. So Ticomborero is seconded to the OCOCOM, if I'm not mistaken. Ticomborero, do you want to unmute yourself? I think your question comes from an experience of how do we manage the river basin organizations in Southern Africa. I'm going to unmute you now.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
No, that's fine. I think I'm answered because I was
okay.
From the introduction, it said the basin is shared by Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, and I could see from the map, which was presented in one of the slides, you can see that Chile is somewhere down there, and basically the basin was being shared by only the name shared by Peru and Bolivia. And throughout the way it was split, you could see that you were talking about Peru and
Bolivia. We can't understand it. We can't. There is some disruption in the way your voice comes out, and I mean, Emilia, I don't know if you can, but I have not been able to pick up.
No, that's fine. I'm saying I'm answering because from the introduction, Emilia said that the basin is being shared by 3 countries. And throughout this presentation, you are referring to Bolivia and Peru and not Chile. And you could see from one of these slides showing the map, you could see that Lake is between Bolivia and Peru. So I just wondering why Chile.
Sorry, Ticomborero, you'll have to type this. There is a disturbance in the line. We cannot hear what you're saying. Okay. But yeah, so I think
we can't hear you, Clara.
In Southern Africa, a basin authority will be exactly that. So the countries involved are those that sort of are relevant throughout the entire basin and not just focusing on one specific resource. So that's why I think it was a little bit odd in comparative terms between what happens in Titicaca and what happens here. I'm going in order of arrival onto the screen. So Rodolfo, you had a question. Rodolfo is the chief of party for the Sustainable Water Partnership of Windhoek International and Tetra Tech. Rodolfo, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question because you did not type it up. So go ahead. Rodolfo? Have we lost Rodolfo now? Yep. Okay. Rodolfo, you're unmuted. You're welcome to ask your question.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. Unfortunately, I arrived a little bit late, so maybe this was covered. And I heard there was a discussion about the with the governance about what's the institution governing any agreement between Lake Titicaca between Peru and Bolivia. I just wanted to understand a little bit more how that's working. If there is a permanent institution, or it's just pretty much an agreement between the two countries to discuss the shared resources in Lake Titicaca. And this is a very complex system. So I guess, if you can just briefly mention something about that. But the other thing is, as usually, look like Bolivia is it's a good approach to show benefits to both countries and how that, good management of resources would benefit both. But my question is there's trust? I mean, especially Bolivia, a poorer country than Peru, and this happens. We have the same situation in the Mara River Basin. We have Kenya upstream and Tanzania downstream in our work, and that how is there is trust. I mean, there's a question about trust and about how this binational whatever agreement is working in terms of bringing the trust between the two countries to work together towards those resources, to the management of those resources jointly.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think many of the basins in the South Hemisphere share very similar problems, and patterns. In the case of the Authority of Lake Titicaca, it's a permanent institution. It has a secretariat. It has its own judiciary personality, so they are able to capture funds and implement projects, and they are under the overview of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of Peru and Bolivia. Nevertheless, it hasn't been easy. I think it has always been facing political sensitivity with the countries. There is a problem of competencies and a lack of clarity of what they need to do and what not. So these gray areas on the role of this authority has created a number of conflicts that could have been avoided if from the beginning the authority would have been very clearly defined on what was the purpose of the authority. So we have been taking, we are actually now in a process of advising both countries on how to reshape this authority, this RBO, and how to modernize it, and how to establish much clearer limits to the role they have in the basin. But one of the problems is the limitations they have to focus only on the water screen and not on the broader basin, because this compromises the capacity they have to influence the agendas on both sides of the border and to reach agreements in order to for example, build river basin plans in cooperation, or to reach agreements, for example, on sensitive topics such as this water diversion system that I am referring to in the case of Titicaca. So there is the challenge. Of course, benefit sharing process should be conducted in close coordination with an RBO, but you can also have the scenario where you don't have an RBO, and that's the case in some of the basins we are working in South America, where there is no formal institutionality yet to coordinate and facilitate transboundary relations, and then you need to start from different angles and to try to work with the governmental institutions in order to build that dialogue. I think one of the interesting things of benefit sharing is that one of the outcomes of this process will be that we need to have a platform of cooperation. Whatever it's the name, it can be an RBO, it can be a more informal community of practice, but you need to have some level of coordination in order to implement these solutions. And this is something we will see in the coming steps. In the steps 5 and 6, we will pay attention into that relevance of having instruments and institutional arrangements in order to put into practice all the assessed initiatives through the benefit sharing process.
Okay, thank you.
We are already 4:15, so I'm a bit conscious of time. There were just 2 questions that are still pertaining to your presentation. I'm not going to unmute to avoid sort of further time usage. So Carolyn McCurdy asks, and I think this is in relation to your latest screens, who determines whether there is a positive or negative impact? So is that discussed in your scenario planning sessions, or is there a different type of assessment?
This is done in a participatory way in a workshop. So these matrices can be done with a number of stakeholders. You can split them up in different groups. So each group can assess the impacts, and then you combine this to see, to have like a more democratic and unbiased way of finding the positives and negatives. So of course, there will be conflict of interest sometimes, and some stakeholders will see negative impacts where there are positive or neutral. And that's why it's important, the methodology you use in your workshops.
Yeah, and also I think to have an independent sort of unbiased facilitator always helps.
Of course, yes.
So there's one last question from Manuel Magomi from IMWI in South Africa, and I don't know if you can entirely address this because it's very dependent on the process and on the situation, but based on the example that you gave on Lake Titicaca, he says he'd like to know if the cost of, say, projects like improving the irrigation efficiency, if you have that as an action or as a project, who will fund it? Will it be the different countries involved, or who would fund the cost of any actions that needs to be taken to improve the governance or quality of the system?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because, and we will reach this in the step 6, because part of the implementing conditions for taking the benefit sharing process into action is to find funding and to think about financing schemes. So in this case of the Titicaca, the money from the government that was going to be invested in infrastructure of the water diversion system can be instead invested on a irrigation technification initiative in Tacna. So in this case, we are talking about public funds that can be reallocated. In other cases, no, you will need to create a project, to design a new program, and to find funding. Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much based on the process and the locations and sort of finding feasible solutions. Right. So are you going to continue the presentation, or is
yes,
Laura?
Yes, I continue, and Laura will open her microphone now. Thanks.
Okay. Great.
Hi,
Thank you.
Everyone. Hi,
Hello,
everyone.
Laura.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you, SWP. Like 10 minutes.
Laura, you basically have 10 minutes. Sorry about that. Thanks.
Don't you worry. So we're going through the last steps of the BOAT methodology, and step number 4 is estimating the cost and benefits from future scenarios, because we always say, like, okay, so Bolivia is going to benefit or Peru is going to benefit, but how much are they going to benefit? Emilia, could you please, next slide? Thank you very much. So there are 2 ways to quantify cost and benefits. The first one goes with environmental indicators, and the other one goes with estimating the economic value. It is most important to evaluate the environmental indicators because this is the base for all of the other benefits. How much water is going to be maintained or improved on the flocks? Is the quality of the water is going to be maintained or improved, or are there other benefits related to the cooperative management? And the economic value is a way to estimate or to compare these alternatives. So which one is better for the developmental scenario? This doesn't mean that it's really difficult when you talk about economic value, because there are things that cannot be monetized, that they don't have a price, like human health or the cultural heritage. As Emilio said, there are some big heavy metals in the Titicaca Basin that are being diluted by this water, and people and animals drink this water. So you cannot put a price on their health, or either you cannot put a price on the legend that says the Titicaca is the place birth of the Inca culture. those things are really hard to put a price on, and evaluating through economic methods is not putting a price of things, but making things comparable one to each other. So we're gonna go with environmental indicators first. Emilio, please. Next slide. Thank you very much. We're taking one of the indicators, which is water. And this is done through several spatial modeling software that's available to quantify how much the quantity, quality, or flux of water is going to affect the ecosystem, or is going to affect the economic activities. You need water for agriculture. So how much water do you need to a certain culture is a way of estimating how much this is going to be affected. In this case, the diversion of the Mayo River will affect heavily on the Copaiza Salt Lake, which is already facing several challenges due to climate change. It's a lake that is appearing and disappearing because of the lack of water. So you need to find out which way of activities or interventions will produce the most array of benefits. How much water do you need for agriculture? How much water do you need for environmental flows? How much water do you need for industry? And estimating those flux into a spatial modeling or other sort of software modeling can help you understand these issues. Next slide, please. And the other way is to perform economic valuation. There are several kinds of I'm sorry for the background sound, those are my kids. There are several methods for doing economic valuation. The most easy ones goes with things that have market value, like farming, livestock, fishing, wool production, tourism, and mining. And there are other benefits that do not have a market value, which need economic valuation techniques that are not, I wouldn't say harder, but that have more complexity to be done. For example, how do we evaluate this identity and culture that the indigenous communities in the Titicaca have with the lake? That's part of their identity, the birthplace of their communities. So could you go to the next slide, please? Here we've done the same very basic table that Emilia showed you before. We've put numbers on this. This is really simplified, because on agriculture, for example, we've only take quinoa, which is a high importance culture in the Altiplano, but we have not placed potatoes, for example, which is also very important in the region. For wool production, we've only take the alpacas, but there are other manufacturers that we have not taken into account. So the thing here is to show you that that this cost and benefit analysis can be done. It can be done from statistic data that's available, the GDP, the stock market, the international prices, and you can also perform your own questionnaire surveys to understand how people evaluate these services. For example, tourism, we've placed these numbers on the mean expenditure a foreigner tourist has on the Titicaca. And we've multiplied that by the number of tourists. So there are several methods through which you can arrive to these numbers. Can you go to the? So we see here that the different. So this is the numbers we've shown from several sources. We have statistics for the international price of quinoa. And this also needs some level of coordination between the countries, because, for example, Peruvian quinoa has one price that is lower to Bolivia's quinoa due to the quality of the product. So when we use this average price, you need to have all the parties involved agree on that price. On tourism as well, how much the tourist expense is a question of the countries. So you need to have some level of assumptions agreed upon the stakeholders first to perform this valuation. And there are several different measures the different methods for economic valuation. For example, if we were to ask how much the Titicaca is valued because it is a Ramsar site or because it has cultural heritage, that would need a specific survey designed for that purpose. But as I was saying, the important thing of performing an economic valuation is the possibility to compare alternatives. So here is the alternatives on the money. As in you can see, even the Mauri division project has less economic return to Peru than performing an enhanced water use on the Tacna and in the Pacific Ocean, because Peru will lose money on the wool production of alpaca and on the tourism if that water is diverted. So when you start thinking of the basin and on the total of interventions of the basin and the total array of benefits that come from this joint management, and not just one single project and the impacts of that one single project, you arrive to these scenarios where we have gain-gain situations, because Bolivia will also benefit from a better use in water for irrigation in the Pacific coast, because it will not affect its own agriculture, it will not affect its own wool production or its own tourism. And we're seeing this just on 3 very easy benefits to evaluate because they have market prices. If we do this, adding all of these other benefits like peace, like cooperation, like health, like cultural heritage, these metrics will get a lot more complex, but it will show also that the array of benefits have different impact. The interventions have different impacts on the benefits, and there's not only one possible way of doing things. Next slide, please. So we're now going to this part where we have to negotiate these benefits. We've already identified who gets what, how much does one gets. So using the inputs from these enhanced scenarios and discuss benefit analysis, we can choose the best developmental pathway for the basin. So this goes through a continuous process of dialogue, who, how, and what is going to be done in this basin, who is going to benefit, and how the people that are occurring into impacts are going to be compensated about that. And you need to assure that there is engagement in this process, because the buy-in is very important to compliance. If everyone agrees on how things are going to be done, then everyone will be sure that things are done that way. So agreements and transforming potential conflicts into constructive engagement will go into voluntary compliance of these agreements. And this, of course, is context dependent. You need to understand how water flows through the basin, how the stakeholders are linked to each other, how much power is within one or other group of stakeholders, because those interdependencies and links will have a different power to negotiate the most agreeable scenario. So I'm going to say that this is a very, very large, almost complex process. Negotiation is not always easy, because you need to switch this idea from water allocation or from one single project to the array of benefits to the most stakeholders in the basin. And this is going to be taken into account in the next session of the webinar series, so I'm not going to delay myself on this, and I'm going back to Emilio for the last step.
Thanks a lot, Maria Laura. I will take only 3 more minutes to end this presentation with step 6. We are not getting deep into these steps 5 and 6 because you already had a deeper view of this with Alejandro Isa in the previous webinar, and you will have a next one with my colleague Diego Jara that will explain also elements that will touch base on these issues. So finally, the sixth step is setting up institutional agreements and implementation mechanisms. What you have as a result from the negotiation process in the previous step is a set of agreements. No, you reach agreements between stakeholders about how to conduct an activity, but of course, that agreements need to materialize into action, and that's another challenge, another important steps that needs a lot of consideration, a lot of effort to happen. Opportunities and mechanisms for benefit sharing will be context specific again and must be adapted to the social, political, economic, and environmental context. Each basin has a different reality, a different type of institutional matrix organization, different power relations between stakeholders, different levels of development, and here we need to consider all that context. Some examples of benefit sharing mechanisms or how to implement this, for example, through knowledge sharing, through projects, designing these projects and finding finance for implementing new projects or alternative ways of doing projects, revenue allocations and financial arrangements, institutional and policy development. Here, institutions play a pivotal role in taking agreements into actions. And this is something that you saw in the previous presentation with Alejandro, where he presented the different elements and conditions that an institution should have in order to move things forward. What are the capacities that you should have as an institution, as an RBO, for example, to take transboundary negotiations into action, no? To have the technical and the resources to build dialogues and to be effective in the role you have in the basin. No? So here you see some aspects that are important for implementing adequately the agreements and grounding the benefit enhancing scenario. At the end, what we want is to choose the best pathway for the basin, and then we need to think on how to take it into action. You know, you probably work a lot with the river basin plans. How many times we see that nice documents, that nice plans being only paper and never actions, no? So there is the challenge, how to take the letters and the intentions in an agreement, in a plan, into actions. And for this, for implementing that agreements, functional institutions are critical. No? Interinstitutional arrangements also, we need to have good coordination between institutions. Governmental institutions, but also informal institutions in the river basin. We need funding, we need financial mechanisms, no, that can also inject funds to the projects and to the alternatives we want to promote in the basin. We need monitoring and enforcement mechanisms in order to see how things are developing, in order to see how laws and agreements are being implemented. And finally, we need expert advice groups. This is very important. Basin management demands special knowledge on specific actions, on specific decisions, and for this you need expert advice. So these are some elements that are important to understand. Again, as you see, this is a logical series of steps that intend to build a dialogue that goes from identifying stakeholders, from identifying the range of benefits and building scenarios, to estimating the costs and quantifying quantitatively that costs and benefits of the different scenarios, then discussing about that different scenarios and picking up the best scenario for everyone, and finally implementing that agreements in the basin. No? So to close this session, I would like to mention a couple of ideas that are important to take away from this approach. One is that water is more than water. As I told you, you need to think on that indirect relations of water use, no? And that collateral benefits that may arise from the water use. Benefit sharing can be used to enhance water governance and schemes. We are talking about governance. No? Benefit sharing is a way of enhancing water governance. We need context-specific approach. As I told you, each basin has its own reality. Sometimes you can use these benefit sharing methodology just to assess one project, for example, one hydropower project that is causing conflict in a basin, and you want to see if it's worth doing it or not. And both countries want to reach a pragmatic conclusion to take a decision. You can conduct a benefit sharing methodology to evaluate if that project makes sense. What if you don't do the project, but instead you invest in other things? Or what if you do a different project, a smaller hydropower plant, and you will have different outcomes. So this can be used for assessing one project, an array of 2 or 3 projects, or the whole combination of developmental initiatives in a basin. Also, be sure to have quality data before conducting a benefit sharing process. If you don't have good data, if you don't have a good estimation of what is happening in the basin, the whole process will be biased. No? And the matrices with the positive and negative impacts will be biased, and the final outcome will be not real and realistic. And what will happen if we do a benefit sharing process with bad quality data is that we may end up creating more conflict than solving conflicts. No? Because we will create an unreal scenario, and we will take decisions under unreal considerations. Finally, evaluation is critical to compare objectively the different basin intervention. This is why we can not only stay with step 3 with the qualitative exercise. We need to quantify, and the evaluation is not necessarily economic. No, you can also have you can evaluate the cultural and biodiversity, and that's not necessarily a financial number, and that needs to be recognized as well. That's all. I hope you had some overview of this innovative methodology. We are trying to implement this in different basins with our program in IUCN, and we think it's quite useful. We have found this as a really a novel and productive way of building dialogue. It's not easy, it takes time, but I hope this gives you some ideas and new insights into how you can solve your challenges in the basins you are working with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Emilio and Laura and Rebecca, for this very interesting presentation and case studies. I would like to apologize for our participants. We've gone a little bit over the line, but it's also because we had some interesting discussions along the way. There is one question from the audience, from Mohammed. And Mohammed asks if, in the absence of political will, so the government's willingness to talk on water sharing or sharing of benefits, how does one kickstart the process of benefit sharing? And he quotes as an example the Kabul River Basin between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Not an easy sort of political geographical position in any case, but even more so. And both countries are upper and lower riparians, but there is extreme trust deficit. So based on your experiences with your methodology, are there any suggestions for Muhammad?
Thanks. Yeah, that's the case in many transboundary basins where you don't have the trust between countries. But that doesn't mean that you don't have the trust between local communities. And at least in our cases, we have tried in that scenarios to go through local communities first, because they are the ones interested in cooperating. They are living in the basin and they are using the water, or they are being impacted by any type of water use. So in these cases, what we try to do is to begin the process from down to top. Of course, we would like to involve governmental agencies since the beginning, but in some cases they won't, and you will need to go on at least to prepare the terrain, doing the exercise at the very local level with local communities. We haven't had the case, at least in South America, where governments haven't been willing to cooperate and be part of these processes. So what we have done is, for example, in Lake Titicaca, I won't say that the relations are critical between Bolivia and Peru. There is cooperation. There is a level of trust there are certain topics that are sensitive. For example, the Mauri River that we analyzed in this example is the most sensitive topic, and that creates clashes between countries. So as IUCN, as Bridge, as an external actor trying to facilitate that process, we need to be very careful on how we run these negotiations and these processes with the local communities, because we don't want to create more conflict between countries. So we try to go step by step, starting with local communities and trying to invite officers from governmental agencies so they can start being involved from the local level. And then we try to show what we are doing to the national governments and to visualize the need to establish a cooperation platform in order to provide all the needed conditions to work at the basin level. It's not easy, and in some cases, as the example you mentioned, you may need to go on with local communities and to work at that subnational level, until you have better conditions and you can scale up that dialogue to a more diplomatic and high level process where the benefit sharing ideas and conclusions and results can be discussed between countries in a formal figure.
Yeah, thank you. Mohammed, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Has your attempt to resolve your question been addressed? Are there any follow-up questions for Emilio? I very much agree with you, Emilio. Sometimes when it's difficult to approach this from a high-level perspective, it is that much better to start at the local level and then let the seed grow internally within the government organizations and go up the stream, instead of as an external party approach the national level directly. Muhammad, have you got any other follow-up question? Has anybody else has got any more comments or sharing of experiences from your perspective with the presenters and the participants? I'm unable to unmute. Okay, sorry. Let me unmute you. There you go. You may speak.
Okay,
sorry.
Thank you very much. It's quite helpful. I mean, I genuinely enjoyed the presentation. The thing is, I mean, we have a very elaborate kind of agreement with India. So I'm from Pakistan, and there's an Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan signed in 1960, where both countries agreed on dividing the rivers between India and Pakistan. So it was, totally collapse of benefit sharing approach. So with Afghanistan, we do not have any agreement at the moment, and there has been, organization trying to promote this idea of benefit sharing in case of any future agreement between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I was just trying to conceptualize, in the absence of any, trust between the countries, how would they arrive at this benefit sharing approach? I mean, there are studies being conducted, but yeah, in isolation, not any buy-in from the governments.
Yeah, so your main concern is actually to even just start to initiate some sort of coherent dialogue between the parties, and perhaps work at it from a sort of within country perspective, and then start to bring the stakeholders, as you see common points, start to bring the stakeholders together across the countries and sort of work it up way from there. It's a long process, but if you find sort of similar stakeholders like yourself, you are CJIR, I see from your email address, that you have to build a team, and then maybe you can shorten
Just to add a bit, what we are trying is starting from the academic institutes and mainly the NGOs and INGOs working in both countries, and we have had dialogues in the past few years. So we are trying to build from this to generate evidence, and based on that evidence to convince the policymakers. I think, I mean, going forward, that would be a right approach. I mean, just a comment from your side.
Rebecca, Emilio, Laura?
No, well, I think the same as the question before, that where you don't have that conditions of having agreements and diplomatic channels that are already happening, you need to move on at the local level. And as I told you, benefit sharing, the methodology is a long process. No, it's not a one workshop or two workshops. It's a process because you need to collect data. You need to sometimes to do research to find some of the knowledge you need to conduct the benefit sharing method. And you can gain time now. If you don't have yet the conditions, you can start at least understanding the power relations, understanding what are the main problems in the basin, and trying to take that into the governmental agencies. I am also a bit skeptical that you can conduct a successful benefit sharing process without formal institutions, without the governments, because at the end you will need to have binational transboundary agreements, and these need to be implemented at the diplomatic level. No, so as far as you can work with the subnational levels, no, with the subnational levels in the border areas, reaching agreements and finding solutions for the challenges they have, I think you need to be insistent in inviting the governments, no, and in parallel working at the diplomatic level. At least this is something we have done with Bridge in the last 10 years, is work with this multi-level governance approach. And it's about that, doing different processes at different levels at the same time. So for example, in the Titicaca, this is a good example. We are working at the very local level with a group of indigenous women, with a network of women. And we are doing water monitoring, water quality monitoring, political incidents. So this is a group that is starting to have incidents in their municipalities. Some of them are working as officers in the municipalities, and they're doing a lobby agenda to promote the protection of water. And at the same time, we are in a dialogue with the governments, with the ministries of foreign affairs, to reshape the authority of Lake Titicaca. No, so we are working with the formal institutions, with the government, and at the local level. Things are not yet there. We are progressing, but it's important to keep contact, no, with all these different stages. But there may be the case, and maybe that's your case, where it's very difficult to approach the governmental agencies, no, because you have very isolated governments that try to take the diplomatic agenda only by themselves, are a bit jealous to open to external agencies that want to cooperate with them. So you will have that scenario in many countries, and then it's more tricky, no, because it's very difficult to access and to build a dialogue. And yeah, I mean, it's part of the work, and it's part of the agenda, I think, from our position from the cooperation, to try to find different ways of opening windows of communication with governments. One that has been successful in our case is to provide trainings to the governments. So through trainings, capacity building, we offer courses on hydrodiplomacy, for example. That's a good starting point, because you will start knowing the officers in the government. They start understanding that you come from a neutral standpoint, from a pragmatic science-based standpoint, and you only want to improve governance and capacities, and try to think for things to work. So that's what I can say, at least from my experience.
Yeah, thank you, Miguel. I think what you just said is actually very important. In this process, don't focus so much on the trust between the two countries, which is something that you really cannot solve individually, but rather look at the trust relationship of yourself and your institutions and your team and your colleagues with the country and the government systems that you're working in. And that will really carry you a long way in trying to achieve a larger circle of trust. And by working at multi-scale, so you're working on your local projects that you see can work and you can handle as your own institution, or like a variety of local partners that you already identified, and then use that as an entry point to government in terms of reporting back. So to say, you know, this is what we've done and this is how it works, and think about if we could do it a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and if we could work together on this scenario. So you have to be creative in how to engage government and how to create a trust relationship with government officials at local level and as much as at national level, and then see where that takes you. I like the idea of trainings. It's a very, very good idea, because you open up their understanding and you open yourself up to them so they can see that you are a truly sort of independent operator. I don't see any other questions, but Muhammad says thank you very much, and he appreciates the reflections on the questions. I would like, we are now at 10 to 5, so we really have exhausted more than our time allocation. But I would like to thank all of you for attending, and the 3 presenters that we've had for sharing their experiences, their knowledge, and in the late Titicaca and in the Southern American experience. We wish you all the best to resolve all the remaining important conundrums that you have to achieve that full cooperation. You know, as much as we can say it can be done without legal frameworks, that legal framework gives you that much more power of implementation and authority also within governments to make sure that cooperative systems happen. So maybe you can attend the session that we're going to do with Tariro on the Southern African experiences and see what have we done from Southern Africa and how you can learn the lessons from for your basin. If you can all see the screen, I would like to thank you once again and remind you that we meet again next week for our 4th session on this transboundary series with Diego Jara, who will talk to us about hydrodiplomacy. So if you're interested in working in the work with governments and what does it mean when we talk about hydrodiplomacy and how difficult that is and how long does that take to, please join us next week for more learning. And once again, thank you everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day from wherever you are, whenever you're connected. Thank you all. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Emilia, for the wonderful presentation. Have a good day further.
Thanks. Take care. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.